I mercati si apprestano a chiudere uno dei migliori anni dell'ultimo decennio. Ma che cosa ci aspetterà nel 2024 e quali saranno i principali eventi da seguire? Ne parliamo in questa puntata di Stay Live, rimanete con noi. Ben ritrovati a questa nuova puntata di Stay Live. Oggi parleremo delle prospettive dei mercati per il 2024 e lo faremo in compagnia del nostro ospite, quindi vado subito a salutare Paul Jackson, Global Head of Asset Allocation and Research di Invesco. Benvenuto a financiallounge.com.
Thank you, Annalisa.
Iniziamo subito da qual è la vostra visione per il 2024. Vedremo finalmente delle banche centrali più dovish e soprattutto ci sarà la così tanta temuta recessione?
Well, I think 2024 we will see at the beginning of the year a continued slowdown in the global economy, less growth, which I think will enable inflation to come down further, which should mean that central banks can start to reduce interest rates by the second quarter. And usually when central banks reduce interest rates, they go very quickly. So I'm looking actually for pretty aggressive rate reductions through to the end of 2024.
Ecco, abbiamo visto quest'anno caratterizzato da tantissime crisi geopolitiche, soprattutto quella in Medio Oriente. Il prossimo anno poi ci saranno eventi politici di grandissima rilevanza come le elezioni presidenziali. Quanto influiranno questi eventi sull'asset allocation?
Well, usually politics and geopolitics don't have a big impact on asset allocation, but I think you're right. The big event for 2024 is likely to be the US election. And there could be some tension that comes from that, especially if it's a close result. We saw last time in 2020 how Donald Trump challenged the results. So there could be quite a bit of tension, but usually I think the economic cycle is the most important influence. Perhaps the biggest political factor or geopolitical factor that I worry about is the situation in the Middle East. If we think back to the 1970s when the Yom Kippur War led to a reduction of oil supply from OPEC, which generated a lot of inflation and global recession. That was a very difficult period for financial markets. So I think that is perhaps the biggest risk and maybe leads us to be a little more cautious in terms of asset allocation than we would be otherwise. But frankly, I really do put most of the emphasis on economic and central bank cycles when it comes to thinking about asset allocation.
Scendendo più nel dettaglio degli investimenti, come cambierà la composizione di portafoglio e la ripartizione tra azioni e obbligazioni?
Yeah, I'm actually relatively optimistic for 2024, largely because I think central banks will be reducing interest rates. This should enable bond yields to come down, and after all, bond yields have reached levels that they haven't been for quite some time. So there is a good level of income. As yields come down, that will generate capital returns. So I think across the broad spectrum of assets, we will see probably the best returns since 2019. From an asset allocation perspective, I am actually favoring investment grade credit. So I've got the maximum allocation to investment grade credit. I'm slightly underweight government bonds. I prefer investment grade amongst the defensive fixed income assets. I'm also overweight high yield and bank loans, two asset categories which are a bit riskier than investment grade. And I've also boosted the allocation to real estate, which we know that real estate has some fundamental problems at the moment with the reduced demand for retail space, but also reduced demand for office space. But nevertheless, I think a lot is already in the price, so I'm overweight real estate, and I've boosted the allocation to equities. But within equities, there is a problem. Equity markets, if you take a capitalization weighted approach, you have the problem of a US market that is extremely concentrated, and an index such as the S&P 500 is pretty expensive on that basis. So globally, I'm a little bit underweight equities, even though I've increased the allocation. But within equities, I favor Europe versus the US, for example, and I favor emerging markets. But yes, to come back to your original question, I think that bonds are back, and for the first time in a long time, we can favor bond allocations in a way that I couldn't have imagined 3 or 4 years ago. I can now contemplate owning government bonds and investment grade credit, which was very difficult to do until very recently.
Bene, volendo sintetizzare, sarà un anno complesso in cui non mancheranno i driver da seguire, ma ci saranno comunque delle opportunità per gli investitori più attenti. Quindi io ringrazio Paul Jackson, Global Head of Asset Allocation Research di Invesco, di essere stato con noi, di questo interessantissimo spaccato sulla situazione macroeconomica e degli investimenti per il 2024. Grazie.
Thank you.
Grazie a tutti voi di averci seguiti, come sempre vi do appuntamento al prossimo Stay Live e voi continuate a seguirci su financiallounge.com.